The abnormal invention. In a quiet, unassuming village lived Dr. Liam, a brilliant but reclusive inventor known for his strange machines and unusual interests. He wasn't interested in fame or money, only in his relentless pursuit of science. His latest invention was meant to push the boundaries of reality, a machine he claimed could tap into the consciousness of the dead. He called it the Veil Shifter. Despite warnings from locals, Liam tested the machine. At first, it seemed to have no effect, but as days went by, he noticed oddities around his home. Unexplainable noises echoed at night. Shadows moved in the corners of his eyes, and a sense of cold seemed to settle on his property. Soon, he realized he hadn't just opened a channel to the dead. He had opened a portal to something far more terrifying. The story delves into Dr. Liam's gradual descent into horror as he encounters entities with twisted faces, voices whispering his darkest fears, and visions of his past mistakes. Each attempt to reverse the effects only strengthens the pull of the other side. As the hour progresses, we learn about Liam's tragic past, the loss of his family, and how his desire to reconnect with them may have driven him to open doors best left shut. In the climax, Liam finds himself trapped in his own invention, his spirit forever entangled with those he once sought to understand. And when a new inventor stumbles upon the abandoned house, the Veil Shifter hums to life once more, awaiting its next victim. As Dr. Liam's life spiraled further into a surreal nightmare, the strange happenings around his home only grew more intense. The eerie noises grew louder, the shadows sharper and more defined. At night, he would hear scratching sounds, like claws raking across wood, coming from the walls. But when he'd look, there would be nothing, just silence. And yet he could feel a presence, watching him, lurking just beyond sight. One evening, desperate for answers, he decided to turn on the Veil Shifter again. He adjusted its settings, hoping to recalibrate the machine to see if he could communicate with whatever had slipped through. This time, as the machine hummed to life, the lights in his home flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. But then, something even stranger happened. A thick fog began to pour from the device, filling the room. Dr. Liam reached out to shut it off, but before he could, a figure started to form in the mist. At first it appeared human, a woman with familiar features. It was his late wife, Nora. She looked just as she had the last time he saw her, but something was wrong. Her eyes were hollow, filled with a darkness that seemed to pull everything in. She didn't speak, but her mouth moved as though she was trying to. A faint whisper echoed through the room, soft and chilling. "Why did you call me here?" Dr. Liam's heart sank. He tried to explain, stumbling over his words, but she only shook her head. The whisper turned to a haunting wail as the fog began to twist, distorting Nora's face into something nightmarish. Her features stretched, her eyes widening as if absorbing every fear he'd ever had. The room filled with a cacophony of voices, overlapping, each one screaming or pleading, as if trapped in eternal torment. Realizing he'd lost control, Liam reached for the machine, trying to shut it down, but it wouldn't turn off. The buttons were stuck, and the device seemed to have a life of its own, pulsing with an unnatural energy. The fog now swirled around him, binding his wrists, pulling him toward the Veil Shifter. He struggled, but the grip was too strong, the fog too dense. Desperate, he yelled for help, though he knew no one was nearby to hear him. Then, as his vision began to blur, he saw them. figures emerging from the fog, their faces grotesquely twisted, each one a distorted echo of someone he knew. Old colleagues, former friends, even his parents, all people from his past, all staring at him with eyes that glinted with malice and betrayal. He realized these were not his loved ones, but malevolent entities using their faces, feeding off his memories and emotions to torment him. In a final act of desperation, Dr. Liam lunged toward the power switch on the wall, ripping it down. The veil shifter powered down, and silence fell. The fog dissipated, and the room returned to normal. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. He hoped it was over, but in the days that followed, he noticed that the entities hadn't left. They lingered, now fully manifesting in mirrors, in his dreams, in the faint whispers he heard wherever he went. The veil shifter had served as their invitation, and now they were bound to him, feeding off his fear and despair. In the final scene, we see Dr. Liam, a hollowed-out version of himself, aimlessly wandering his house, muttering to the shadows that follow him. His invention, left in pieces, sits in the corner, awaiting the moment when someone else might find it, unknowingly reawakening the horrors he unleashed. Dr. Liam's once brilliant mind was now fractured, a maze of paranoia and fear, as the malevolent entities seemed to have entrenched themselves in every corner of his life. Sleep became impossible. The entities appeared in his dreams, tormenting him with visions of people he had wronged, failures he regretted, and mistakes he couldn't forget. Each night, he would hear whispers of accusations and see warped faces staring back at him from the shadows. His home had turned into a prison, and there was no escape. Desperate for help, Dr. Liam decided to reach out to an old friend, Professor Eliza Moore, a renowned psychologist and one of the few people who still cared about him despite his eccentricities. He called her in the middle of the night, his voice shaky and pleading. "Eliza, please. I need you to come. There's something in my house. Something not of this world." Reluctantly, Eliza agreed, concerned for her friend's well-being. The following morning she arrived at Liam's house, her skepticism evident, but tempered by her compassion. As she entered, a shiver ran down her spine. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was alive and breathing. Dr. Liam greeted her, looking gaunt and haunted, his eyes sunken and darting nervously. He led her to the lab, where the dismantled veil shifter sat like a silent menace. "It started with this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I tried to reach across to the other side, to speak to them, but I've unleashed something I can't control." Eliza studied the machine, a complex array of wires, switches, and strange symbols. She questioned him, trying to understand his motives, but the more she listened, the more she sensed that something was very wrong. Shadows flickered in the corners of the room, and she felt an inexplicable chill settle over her, as though unseen eyes were watching her every move. "Liam, this is beyond science. Whatever you think you're dealing with, it's dangerous. We need to destroy this device," she said, firmly. Dr. Liam hesitated, torn between his desire to end the torment and his obsession with understanding what lay beyond. But the choice was taken from him when a sudden deafening crash echoed from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They weren't alone. Eliza grabbed Liam's arm, urging him to leave, but he was rooted to the spot, his face pale with terror. The footsteps grew louder, each step heavy and deliberate, as if something with immense weight was approaching. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that twisted and writhed as though alive. Then in the doorway, a figure appeared. It was Nora, or rather a twisted version of her face contorted with rage and sadness, her eyes empty black voids. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and behind her, more figures appeared, each one a ghostly specter from Liam's past. They crowded the doorway, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their mouths moving in silent accusation. Eliza, paralyzed with fear, whispered, "Liam, what did you do?" He could only stare, frozen, as the specters began to close in. They moved slowly, methodically, as though savoring his terror. Suddenly, Nora's voice broke through the silence, raspy and filled with anguish. "You were supposed to let us rest, Liam. You betrayed us." In that moment, Dr. Liam snapped. Overcome by guilt, he fell to his knees, pleading with them to forgive him, to release him. But the entities were merciless, their distorted faces growing ever more twisted as they fed off his despair. Eliza, realizing she had to act, grabbed the dismantled veil shifter, hoping to find a way to stop the horrors he'd unleashed. But as she touched the machine, a sharp pain shot through her, and she was thrown back by an invisible force. It was as if the veil shifter itself was alive, possessed by the very spirits it had summoned. With no other options, Eliza shouted, "Liam, we have to destroy it. It's the only way." In a final, desperate act, Dr. Liam staggered to his feet and lunged at the veil shifter. He picked up a heavy metal rod and smashed it down onto the machine, again and again, each strike releasing a burst of cold energy that swept through the room. The specters let out an unearthly shriek, their forms flickering, contorting, and beginning to dissipate as the machine fractured under Liam's blows. Finally, with a deafening crack, the veil shifter shattered, and the specters vanished, leaving only silence in their wake. Liam collapsed to the ground, exhausted and broken, as Eliza rushed to his side. The nightmare was over, or so they thought. In the days that followed, Eliza returned to her life, shaken but relieved to have escaped. However, strange things began to happen. She'd catch glimpses of shadowy figures in her mirrors, hear faint whispers in the dead of night, and every so often she'd feel a cold, familiar chill. For Dr. Liam, the haunting was far from over. Though the machine was gone, the entities were bound to him forever. In his final moments, he realized that he'd never truly severed the connection. The veil shifter had simply been a bridge, and now that he had crossed it, there was no going back. As he looked into his reflection one last time, he saw them standing behind him, their hollow eyes and twisted faces waiting, patient and eternal. In the aftermath of that horrifying night, Dr. Liam's life became an endless cycle of isolation, paranoia, and fear. The spirits hadn't left him. They lingered in the corners of every room, shadows whispering in familiar voices, reminders of his sins and regrets. He had hoped that destroying the veil shifter would bring him peace, but it seemed the machine had only been a conduit. The real connection to the other side had been forged within him. Eliza, too, was struggling to shake the nightmare. She found herself haunted by the faintest traces of Liam's torment. Late at night, her apartment would grow cold. Her reflection would waver in the mirror, and sometimes, just for a moment, she'd catch a glimpse of Liam's face, pale, wide-eyed, and whispering her name. Disturbed and worried, she decided to visit a renowned paranormal expert named Dr. Raphael Crane, known for his experience with cases of lingering supernatural energy. When she met him, she relayed the events in Liam's lab, describing the veil shifter, the spirits, and Liam's gradual descent into madness. Dr. Crane listened intently, nodding as though he'd heard similar stories before. "You mentioned the veil shifter," Dr. Crane said thoughtfully. "If Liam truly broke the boundary between our world and the beyond, it's likely that he bound those entities to himself in a way we can't simply reverse. Destroying the machine might have just weakened the connection, but it didn't sever it." Eliza felt a chill run down her spine. Then, is there a way to help him? Dr. Crane was silent for a moment, as though considering a difficult truth. "There may be one way," he finally said, "but it's dangerous. We'd need to go back to Liam's house, find any remnants of the veil shifter, and conduct a ritual to sever the connection for good. But the risk is high. Those entities will not let go easily, and they may retaliate." Reluctantly, Eliza agreed. She couldn't bear the thought of leaving her friend trapped in his own haunted mind, tormented by beings that used his own memories against him. She returned to Liam's house that evening with Dr. Crane, each of them armed with tools for the ritual: candles, incense, and a grimoire containing ancient words meant to expel spirits. The house was darker and colder than before, as though it had become a vessel for something that thrived in darkness. Shadows pooled in every corner, stretching like skeletal fingers, reaching for the light that dared enter. Dr. Crane lit the candles and instructed Eliza to hold one steady as he chanted, his voice low and rhythmic, filling the room with an ancient, uneasy energy. Then they heard it. A faint laugh, hollow and sinister, reverberating through the walls. Dr. Crane paused, a look of alarm crossing his face. "They know we're here," he whispered, "and they're angry." Suddenly the room erupted in chaos. Objects flew off shelves, windows rattled, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around them. Eliza held her candle tight, fighting to keep her footing as a dark fog seeped from the walls, condensing into the twisted forms of the entities. They circled around her, whispering in voices she recognized. Nora's voice, Liam's voice, and even her own voice distorted and mocking. Through the haze, Eliza saw Liam slumped in a corner, his face hollow and his eyes glazed. He looked up at her, a mix of guilt and despair etched into his expression. "Eliza, I didn't mean for this to happen. I was just so alone," he murmured, his voice echoing through the room. As Dr. Crane resumed the ritual, the shadows began to writhe in agony, their distorted faces stretching and contorting, as if fighting against an invisible force pulling them back. But then, just as it seemed they might weaken, a new figure emerged, a towering, ghastly form with elongated limbs and hollow, gaping eyes. It was unlike the other spirits. It was something far darker, more ancient, something that had come through the veil seeking to feed on despair. The creature turned its gaze to Eliza, its mouth stretching into an impossibly wide grin. "You have no idea what doors you've opened," it whispered in a voice that sounded like 1,000 screams blended into one. "Your friend's invention called us, but you're the key to keeping us here." Before Eliza could react, the creature lunged at her, its shadowy form wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. She gasped, struggling to breathe, as coldness seeped into her skin, filling her mind with visions of every fear she had ever suppressed. Just as she felt herself slipping away, Dr. Crane's voice cut through the darkness, chanting louder, his words fierce and unyielding. With a final burst of strength, Eliza joined him in the chant, her voice steady despite her terror. The creature recoiled, its form flickering as the words sliced through it. The shadows around them began to dissipate, the air growing warmer as the entity's hold weakened. In one last, desperate act, the creature reached for Liam, its elongated fingers wrapping around his throat. "If I can't have her, I'll take you," it hissed. Liam, with a sudden clarity, looked at Eliza and whispered, "I'm sorry," before reaching out and grabbing the remnants of the Veil Shifter's shattered pieces. He held them tight, and with a final scream, he seemed to dissolve into the darkness, taking the creature with him. The room fell silent. The oppressive chill lifted, and Eliza and Dr. Crane were left alone in the dim candlelight, the air heavy with the aftermath of what had just transpired. Eliza felt tears streaming down her face as she realized what Liam had done. He had sacrificed himself, allowing the entities to consume him entirely to save her, breaking the connection once and for all. Dr. Crane placed a hand on her shoulder, his face somber. Sometimes, the only way to close a door is for someone to go through it and never come back. In the days that followed, Eliza couldn't shake the lingering shadows that haunted her thoughts, the faintest whisper of Liam's voice echoing in her mind. She knew that his sacrifice had saved her, but it had also marked her, binding her forever to the memory of his invention and the horrors it had unleashed. And though she had left his house behind, she couldn't escape the feeling that somewhere, in the darkest corners of her mind, a small part of the Veil Shifter still pulsed, waiting for the moment it might come alive once more.